Sometimes a man chooses solitude, and sometimes solitude chooses him. For Jonas McCrae, 23 years of mountain silence had become both his punishment and his refuge. The 50-year-old trapper lived alone in the Colorado Rockies, where winter winds howled like ghosts, and the nearest neighbor was a 3-day ride through snow that could swallow a horse whole. His cabin sat carved into the mountainside, smoke from his chimney, the only proof that life still flickered in this frozen wilderness. Jonas had made peace with his isolation, trading pelts in town twice a year and speaking to no one longer than necessary. But when a woman stumbles onto his land, half dead from cold and running from something that terrified her more than these deadly peaks, his carefully built walls begin to crack. What could drive someone into these mountains in the dead of winter? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jonas McCrae was checking his trap lines when he found her. The February wind cut through the pine trees like a blade, carrying the promise of another blizzard before nightfall. At 50 years old, Jonas had weathered enough Rocky Mountain winters to read the sky like scripture. The pewter clouds gathering over the peaks meant trouble. He should have been heading back to his cabin, but the marten tracks he'd been following for 3 days led deeper into the timber. And good pelts meant the difference between comfort and mere survival when the supply run to Leadville came due. His snowshoes crunched through the crust as he moved between the sets, checking each steel trap with the methodical patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. 23 years of this routine had worn grooves deeper than the mountain paths he followed. Check the traps, reset the springs, follow the animal signs, return to the cabin before dark. The rhythm of it had become a form of prayer, each step an affirmation that he was still alive, still breathing, still moving through a world that had long since forgotten Jonas McCrae existed. The first trap held nothing but wind. The second had been sprung by a clever fox who'd managed to steal the bait without losing so much as a whisker. Jonas reset it with grudging admiration. Survival required respecting your competition, even when that competition was costing you money. The third trap sat undisturbed in the shadows of a fallen pine, but it was at the fourth that Jonas stopped dead. A woman lay crumpled in the snow, 10 yards from his trapline, her dark hair spread across the white like spilled ink. For a moment, Jonas thought she was dead. Her stillness had that quality of finality he'd learned to recognize during his years as a cavalry officer before the mountains claimed him. But then he saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest beneath a torn wool coat, and something stirred in him that he'd thought was buried deeper than winter frost. She was young, maybe 26, with the kind of refined features that spoke of eastern cities and comfortable parlors rather than wilderness survival. Her dress, what remained of it, had once been fine dark blue wool with pearl buttons, now torn and stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. Her hands were bare, the fingers already showing the waxy white of frostbite, and her lips had taken on the blue tinge that meant hypothermia was winning its silent war. Jonas approached with the caution of a man who'd learned that unexpected things in the wilderness were usually dangerous. But as he knelt beside her, he saw no weapon, no sign of deception, only a young woman who was perhaps an hour away from freezing to death. Her breathing was so shallow, he had to lean close to be certain she was still alive, and when he did, he caught the faint scent of lavender soap beneath the smell of pine sap and fear sweat. "Miss?" His voice cracked from disuse. It had been 3 months since he'd spoken to another human being, and the words felt foreign in his throat. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Jonas pulled off his heavy mittens and touched her cheekskin cold as riverstone, but still alive. He'd seen enough hypothermia cases during his army days to know she didn't have long. The decision made itself. He couldn't leave her here to die, regardless of who she was or how she'd come to be unconscious in the middle of his territory. Jonas had carried wounded soldiers before, but this woman seemed to weigh nothing at all. He gathered her against his chest, surprised by how small she felt in his arms after years of handling nothing more delicate than steel traps and rifle barrels. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he adjusted his grip, and he caught another whisper of that lavender center smell that belonged to civilization, to warm rooms and gentle lives, to everything he'd left behind. The journey back to his cabin took longer than usual, Jonas moving carefully through the snow to avoid jarring his unconscious burden. The wind picked up as he walked, driving ice crystals against his face and confirming his earlier reading of the weather. They were in for a hard blow, the kind of storm that could trap a man in his cabin for days. Usually, Jonas welcomed such storms. They were excuses to stay inside with his books and his whiskey, to pretend the outside world had ceased to exist entirely. But now, with a mysterious woman in his arms and questions multiplying like snowflakes, Jonas felt the first stirring of something he hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. His carefully ordered life, built around routine and solitude, was about to be disrupted by forces beyond his control. His cabin sat in a natural depression between two ridges, positioned to catch the morning sun while remaining hidden from casual travelers. Jonas had built it himself during his first winter in the mountains, using pine logs and chinked clay, with windows facing south for light and warmth. Over the years, he'd added a lean-to for storing wood, a smokehouse for preserving meat, and a small stable for the horse and mule that carried his pelts to town twice yearly. The interior reflected 2 decades of bachelor living, functional, clean, but sparse. One room served as kitchen, workshop, and sitting area, with a stone fireplace dominating the north wall. A ladder led to a sleeping loft under the eaves, where Jonas kept his bedroll and the wooden chest that held his few personal possessions. The furnishings were handmade and practical: a plank table, 2 chairs, shelves for his books and supplies, hooks for his rifle and tools. Jonas kicked open the cabin door and carried the woman inside, the warmth from his banked fire, a welcome relief after the bitter wind. He laid her carefully on the narrow bed he kept in the main room, for times when climbing to the loft seemed too much effort. Her breathing remained shallow but steady, and in the firelight he could see more clearly the extent of her condition. Her coat was not just torn but slashed, as if by a knife. Dark stains on the fabric could have been mud, but Jonas's military experience suggested otherwise. Someone had hurt this woman badly and recently. The question was whether that someone might be following her trail. Working quickly, Jonas built up the fire until the cabin filled with dancing light and growing warmth. He heated water in his largest pot and gathered clean rags from his supply of old shirts. The woman needed to be warmed gradually. Too much heat too fast could kill someone with severe hypothermia. He'd learned that lesson watching good soldiers die despite rescue, their hearts stopping when well-meaning medics warmed them too quickly. As the cabin temperature rose, the woman began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered, and soft moans escaped her blue-tinged lips. Jonas knelt beside the bed, uncertain whether her awakening would bring relief or trouble. In his experience, people who ended up half dead in the wilderness usually brought their problems with them. "Easy now," he said, his voice still rough from months of silence. "You're safe. You're in my cabin." Her eyes, open brown eyes, he noticed, dark as pine bark and wide with confusion and fear. She tried to sit up, but Jonas gently pressed her back down. "Don't try to move yet. You were near frozen when I found you. Need to warm up slow-like." She stared at him for a long moment, taking in his bearded face, his weather-worn clothes, the rough interior of the cabin. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Where am I?" "My cabin. High country, about 40 miles northwest of Leadville. Name's Jonas McCrae." He paused, then added, "What's yours?" Fear flickered across her features, and Jonas saw her glance toward the door, calculating distances, looking for escape routes. It was a look he recognized, the expression of someone who'd learned to expect danger from every quarter. "Clara," she said finally. "Clara Merritt." "Well, Miss Merritt, you picked a poor night for traveling. There's a storm coming that'll lock us in tight for maybe 3-4 days. Jonas studied her face, watching for her reaction. Might want to tell me how you came to be lying in the snow in the middle of nowhere, wearing a torn dress and no winter gear." Clara's hand moved instinctively to her throat, and Jonas noticed the bruises there for the first time, finger-shaped marks that spoke of violence. Her breathing quickened, and that hunted look returned to her eyes. I can't tell you that." Jonas nodded slowly. He'd been a soldier long enough to recognize when someone was carrying wounds that went deeper than flesh. But he'd also learned that pushing too hard, too fast, usually made folks clam up entirely. "All right then. For now, let's just focus on getting you warmed up proper. Can you feel your fingers and toes?" Clara wiggled her fingers experimentally, wincing at the sensation. They hurt. "Good. Hurting means they're coming back to life. No hurting would mean something worse." Jonas stood and moved to his supply shelves. "I'm going to make some broth. You need to get something warm in you, and tea won't be enough." As he worked, cutting venison into a pot and adding wild onions and herbs from his stores, Jonas found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. Clara Merritt was not the kind of woman who belonged in these mountains. Everything about her, from her soft hands to her carefully styled hair, spoke of a genteel upbringing, of drawing rooms and dinner parties, rather than snowshoes and survival. Yet here she was, and the fear in her eyes suggested she hadn't come to the high country by choice. The wind outside began to howl in earnest, rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow sliding off the roof in small avalanches. Jonas had weathered hundreds of such storms alone, but now, with a stranger sharing his space, the familiar sounds seemed different, more ominous, more isolating. Whatever Clara Merritt was running from would have to wait. The mountain winter had made the decision for both of them. They were trapped together until spring. 3 days passed before Clara was strong enough to stand without swaying, and Jonas began to hope she might survive whatever ordeal had brought her to his doorstep. The storm he'd predicted had indeed trapped them, howling around the cabin like a living thing and piling snow against the windows until the interior felt like a cave lit only by firelight. During those days, Jonas learned the rhythm of caring for another person, something he'd forgotten after 23 years of solitude. Clara slept most of the first day, waking only to sip broth and accept the warm stones he placed at her feet to combat the lingering cold. By the second day, she was sitting up and speaking in more than whispers, though she remained guarded about her circumstances. On the third morning, Jonas woke to find her standing at the window, watching the snow fall with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Feeling stronger?" he asked, banking the fire and preparing to check his nearby trap lines. "Much, thank you." Clara turned from the window, and Jonas noticed how the firelight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair. "Mr. McCrae, I need to leave as soon as the weather clears." Jonas paused in his morning routine. "That might not be possible, miss. This storm's just the first of several. Winter's got maybe 2 months left in her, and the passes won't be clear until April at the earliest." Fear flickered across Clara's features. "I can't stay here that long. There are people." She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. "People looking for you?" Clara didn't answer, but her silence spoke loudly enough. Jonas finished preparing his pack for the day's work, considering his words carefully. 3 days of shared space had taught him that Clara Merritt spooked easily, like a deer that had learned to expect hunters. "Miss Merritt, I've been living in these mountains long enough to know when someone's running from trouble. Now, I'm not asking you to bare your soul, but if there's danger following you, I need to know about it." "Why?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Jonas met her gaze steadily. "Maybe not, but I found you, and I brought you here, and that makes you my responsibility until you're well enough to make your own choices." For a moment, Clara looked as if she might cry. Then she straightened her shoulders with visible effort and walked to where her coat hung drying by the fire. "Then I'll make my choice now. I'm leaving today. In this weather, you'll be dead before you make it a mile. Better than bringing danger to someone who's shown me nothing but kindness." Jonas watched her struggle with the torn coat, her hands still clumsy from the cold damage. "Clara, The use of her given name made her look up. "Whatever you're running from, it can't follow you through 6 feet of snow and temperatures that'll freeze a man solid in an hour. Nobody's fool enough to travel in this weather. You don't know Sheriff Garrett." The name slipped out before Clara could stop it, and Jonas saw her face go pale with the realization. She sank into one of his handmade chairs, defeat written in every line of her body. "Sheriff Garrett," Jonas repeated. "From where?" Clara was quiet for so long that Jonas thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. "Millerville, about 70 miles southeast of here." She stared into the fire as she talked. "I was the school teacher there. Had been for 3 years, ever since I came west from Pennsylvania after my parents died." Jonas poured himself coffee and waited. He'd learned enough about frightened people to know that patience often succeeded where pressure failed. "Sheriff Garrett decided he wanted to marry me. He's a powerful man in town, owns half the businesses, and has the mayor in his pocket. When I refused him, he made it clear that refusal wasn't an option." "Forced marriage," Jonas said, understanding beginning to dawn. "He arranged it all. Had Judge Morrison ready to perform the ceremony. My boarding house room searched for evidence of improper conduct that would require immediate marriage to preserve my reputation." Clara's hands clenched in her lap. "I knew if I went through with it, I'd never escape. Garrett has a reputation with women. His first wife died under suspicious circumstances, and there were rumors about what happened to a saloon girl who crossed him." Jonas felt anger stirring in his chest, an emotion he'd thought was buried along with his past. "So you ran?" "I tried to, but Garrett had men watching me. I managed to get word to Marshal Hendricks he was passing through town on his way to Denver. He believed me, said he'd heard stories about Garrett from other towns." Clara's voice broke slightly. "The marshal agreed to help me get to Denver, where I could catch a train east." "What happened?" "Garrett found out. He and his men ambushed us about 10 miles outside town. Shot Marshal Hendricks down like a dog." Clara's hand went to her throat, where the bruise marks had faded, but not disappeared. "Garrett told me I had a choice. Come back and marry him quietly, or he'd hunt me down and make sure everyone knew I was a whore who'd gotten the marshal killed." Jonas set down his coffee cup with careful control. "You got away. I had the marshal's horse. It was dark, and I knew they'd expect me to head for the main road. So I went the other way, up into the mountains. I rode for 2 days before the horse went lame, then I walked." Clara looked up at Jonas with eyes that had seen too much. "I don't even know how I ended up on your land. I was just trying to stay ahead of them, trying to find somewhere safe." Jonas moved to his supply shelves and began pulling down items: jerked meat, hardtack, his spare blanket. Clara watched him with growing alarm. "What are you doing?" "Getting ready." Jonas checked his rifle, counting cartridges. "If this Garrett is half as determined as you say, he'll come looking once the weather clears. Might have men already camping in the lower elevations, waiting." "You don't understand," Clara said urgently. "He has 6 men with him, maybe more. You can't fight them all." Jonas looked at her with something that might have been amusement. "Miss Merritt, I spent 12 years as a cavalry officer fighting Apaches, Comanche, and Confederate raiders. I didn't survive by running from fights. But this isn't your fight." "It is now." Jonas's voice carried a finality that stopped Clara's protests. "You're under my roof, which makes it my fight. Besides," he added, checking the loads in his pistol, "I never did like bullies." Clara stared at him, as if seeing him for the first time. The quiet mountain man who'd saved her life was transforming before her eyes into something harder, more dangerous. There was steel in his movements now, a deadly competence that spoke of old training and older skills. "There's something else," she said reluctantly. "Something I found in the marshal's saddlebags after he was killed." Clara went to where her few possessions lay drying by the fire and pulled a small object from the pocket of her torn dress. It was a badge, the marshal's star, but something else. Something that made Jonas's blood run cold. "Where did you get that?" "It was pinned inside his coat. I didn't notice it until after." Clara held up the badge, its metal surface reflecting the firelight. "What is it?" Jonas took the badge with hands that weren't quite steady. It was smaller than a sheriff's star, made of silver, with an eagle, and the words U.S. Deputy Marshal engraved around the edge. He'd seen badges like it before, during his army days. Men who carried them answered to federal authority, not local sheriffs. "Marshal Hendricks wasn't just passing through," Jonas said slowly. "He was investigating something that got him killed." "Investigating what?" Jonas turned the badge over in his hands, thinking, could be anything: land fraud, mail robbery, gun running. But whatever it was federal business, which means Garrett didn't just kill a local lawman, he killed a federal marshal. Clara sank back into her chair as the implications hit her. "That makes it worse, doesn't it? If they find that badge, they'll kill us both to keep it quiet." Jonas slipped the badge into his shirt pocket. "Which means we're not just dealing with a corrupt sheriff anymore. We're dealing with a man who's committed murder to cover up federal crimes." The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the whistle of wind through the eaves. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, but Jonas knew it was only a matter of time. When the weather cleared, Sheriff Garrett would come, and when he did, Jonas would be ready. Clara watched him check his weapons with growing unease. "Mr. McCrae, Jonasi, never meant for this to happen. I never meant to bring this kind of trouble to your door." Jonas looked up from his rifle, and Clara saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It wasn't fear or anger, but something deeper, a kind of grim satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting for this moment without knowing it. "Clara," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice now, warmer somehow. "Some troubles are worth having, and some fights are worth fighting." As if summoned by his words, the wind outside began to die down, and the first breaks appeared in the storm clouds. Winter was loosening its grip, which meant their time of safety was running out. The reckoning was coming. The storm broke on the fourth day, leaving the world transformed under a blanket of pristine snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the morning sun. Jonas stood at his cabin window, coffee steaming in his hands, reading the landscape with eyes trained by decades of mountain living. The silence was profound, the kind of deep quiet that followed heavy snowfall, when even the wind held its breath. "How long do we have?" Clara asked from behind him. She'd been up before dawn, pacing the small cabin like a caged animal. "Hard to say. If they're smart, they'll wait another day or two for the snow to settle, but desperate men don't always make smart choices." Jonas turned from the window. "We should use the time to prepare." Over the past few days, their forced proximity had created an odd intimacy. Jonas found himself aware of Clara's movements, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the soft sound of her breathing as she slept on the narrow bed he'd given up for the chair by the fire. She was unlike any woman he'd known, educated, well-spoken, but with a core of steel that had kept her alive through circumstances that would have broken weaker souls. Clara had proven surprisingly adaptable to cabin life. She'd taken over the cooking without being asked, somehow making his simple supplies taste better than they had in years. She mended his spare shirt with neat stitches and organized his chaotic shelves with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing a classroom. It was domestic in a way Jonas hadn't experienced since he stopped that thought before it could fully form. The past was buried, and it needed to stay that way. "Teach me," Clara said suddenly. "Teach you what?" "How to shoot, how to fight. I won't be helpless when they come." Jonas studied her face, seeing the determination there along with the fear. "You ever handle a gun before?" "My father taught me to shoot when I was young, but that was just target practice with his old rifle. This is different." Jonas nodded. "Yes, it is. Shooting at a man who's shooting back, that's something else entirely." He moved to the wooden chest in the corner, the one that held his most personal possessions. Clara watched as he lifted the heavy lid and began removing items: a pistol in a worn leather holster, a box of cartridges, and something that made her breath catch: a military medal, tarnished with age but still recognizable. "You were decorated," she said softly. Jonas glanced at the medal as if he'd forgotten it was there. Different life, different man. What happened? Why did you leave all that behind? Jonas was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. The medal felt heavy in his hand, heavier than the metal alone could account for. It represented honors earned in blood, a career built on following orders that had eventually become impossible to follow. "Ever hear of Sand Creek?" he asked finally. Clara's face went pale with recognition. Every educated person in America knew about Sand Creek, the massacre of Cheyenne and Arapaho villagers by Colorado militia, an event that had shocked the nation with its brutality. "You were there?" "I was supposed to be. 3rd Cavalry was ordered to support Colonel Chivington's militia." Jonas set the medal on the table between them. "I took one look at what they were, planning women and children included in the target, and refused the order." "You refused?" "Deserted, officially. Rode out the night before the attack, and never looked back." Jonas's voice was matter-of-fact, but Clara could hear the old pain underneath. 150 innocent people died at Sand Creek. Could have been 150, one if I'd stayed and done my duty. Clara reached across the table and touched his hand, the first time she'd initiated physical contact since he'd found her. "You did the right thing." "The right thing got me branded a deserter and a coward, had a price on my head for 5 years before the army stopped caring enough to hunt me." Jonas looked down at where her hand rested on his. Her skin was soft, warm, alive in a way that made something twist in his chest. "That's why I'm up here, Clara. That's why I've been alone for 23 years. Because you couldn't participate in murder. Because I broke my oath. Because when it mattered most, I chose conscience over duty." Jonas pulled his hand free but gently. "Some choices mark a man forever." Clara studied his weathered face, seeing him more clearly now. The isolation, the carefully constructed solitude, it wasn't just the preference of a man who disliked company. It was penance, self-imposed exile for a decision he'd never stopped questioning, despite knowing it was right. "Show me how to use the gun," she said. Jonas spent the morning teaching Clara the basics of his spare revolver, a Colt 44, that had seen better days but still shot true. They used empty tin cans for targets, setting them up in the snow outside the cabin. Clara's hands were steadier than he'd expected, and her aim improved quickly once she stopped flinching at the sound. "Remember," Jonas said, standing behind her as she sighted down the barrel, "don't jerk the trigger. Squeeze it slow and steady, like you're trying not to wake a sleeping baby." Clara nodded, concentrating. The gun bucked in her hands, and one of the cans spun away with a metallic ring. She turned to Jonas with a smile of genuine pleasure, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. When she smiled like that, the fear left her eyes entirely, and he could see the woman she'd been before. Terror changed, her confident, spirited, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with mere physical features. "Good shot," he managed. "Good teacher." Clara reloaded the cylinder, as he'd shown her, her movements growing more confident. "What else should I know?" Jonas considered the question seriously. How to read the land, how to move quietly, how to make yourself hard to find. He gestured toward the tree line. "These mountains can hide you or kill you, depending on how well you understand them." They spent the afternoon covering basic woodcraft, though, to move through snow without leaving obvious tracks, how to read weather signs, how to find shelter and water in the wilderness. Clara absorbed it all with the intensity of someone who understood her life might depend on the knowledge. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold, they returned to the cabin. Clara prepared dinner while Jonas maintained his weapons, the domestic scene oddly peaceful despite the circumstances. But underneath the normalcy, tension hummed like a taut wire. Both of them were aware that their time of relative safety was running out. "Jonas," Clara said as they shared the evening meal, when this is over, what will you do?" "What do you mean?" "Will you stay here? Continue living alone?" Jonas paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. The question touched on something he'd been trying not to think about, the growing awareness that Clara's presence had changed something fundamental in his carefully ordered existence. The cabin felt different with her in it, warmer somehow, more alive. Even the silence between them was companionable rather than empty. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Been alone so long, I'd forgotten what it was like to have someone to talk to, someone to cook for, someone who cares whether you come back safe from checking the trap lines." Clara's cheeks colored slightly. "I do care. About your safety, I mean." "I know." Jonas met her eyes across the small table. "Question is, what will you do? When this is over, I mean." "I can't go back to teaching. Not with my reputation ruined. And I can't go east. I have no family there. No prospects." Clara's voice grew quiet. "I suppose I'll have to figure out how to start over somewhere new." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence, but Jonas found his mind racing. The idea of Clara leaving, of returning to his solitary existence, felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. She'd been in his life for less than a week, but already he couldn't imagine the cabin without her morning humming, her gentle improvements to his rough living arrangements, her quick mind and quicker smile. But what could he offer her? He was a wanted man living in exile, with nothing to his name but a cabin, some traps, and a past he couldn't escape. She deserved better than a life of hiding in the mountains with a broken-down soldier who'd spent 23 years running from his own ghosts. "Clara," he said suddenly, then stopped, not sure how to continue. "Yes?" Jonas looked at her, sitting across from him in the firelight, her dark hair catching the golden glow, her hands wrapped around her cup of coffee for warmth. She was so beautiful it made his chest ache, but more than that, she made him remember what it felt like to have something worth protecting, something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. "Nothing," he said finally. "Just be careful tomorrow. Stay close to the cabin." Clara nodded, but Jonas could see questions in her eyes. Questions he wasn't ready to answer, about feelings he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. The badge hidden in his shirt pocket seemed to burn against his chest, a reminder that their immediate future was far from certain. Outside, an owl called through the darkness, its voice echoing off the mountain walls. Somewhere out there, Sheriff Garrett was making his plans, gathering his men, preparing to reclaim what he considered his property. And somewhere in the space between the fire's warmth and the cold beyond the walls, Jonas McCrae was rediscovering what it meant to have something to lose. The wolves came on the 5th night. Jonas woke to their howling not, the distant songs he was accustomed to, but closer calls that spoke of hunger and desperation. The harsh winter had been hard on all the mountain's creatures, and a pack, driven by starvation, was one of the few things that genuinely concerned him. He slipped from his bedroll by the fire, careful not to wake Clara, and moved to the window. Moonlight on snow revealed dark shapes moving between the tressicks, maybe 7 wolves, their ribs showing starkly through their winter coats. The pack leader, a grey-black female with intelligent yellow eyes, stood at the edge of the clearing, testing the wind. She was calculating, weighing the scents of humans and smoke against the desperate need that had driven her pack down from the high country. Jonas reached for his rifle, checking the load by feel. Movement from the bed made him turn. Clara was awake, her eyes wide in the dim firelight. "What is it?" she whispered. "Wolves, hungry ones." Jonas moved to bank the fire, adding wood to build the flames higher. "They can smell the food we've stored, maybe smell us too. Fire will keep them back, but we need to be ready." Clara rose and reached for the pistol Jonas had given her, her movements now sure and practiced after days of training. "How many?" "7, I think. Maybe 8. Jonas positioned himself at the main window, rifle ready. "They're testing us, seeing if we're easy prey or too much trouble." The pack leader padded closer, her massive form ghosting through the snow with predatory grace. She was magnificent and terrifying, a creature perfectly adapted to this harsh environment. Jonas had seen wolves before, had even traded with trappers who respected them as fellow hunters. But these were different. These were desperate. A younger male broke from the pack, approaching the cabin's north wall where Jonas had hung deer meat to dry. The wolf rose on his hind legs, powerful jaws snapping at the meat just out of reach. His claws scraped against the log walls, and Jonas heard Clara's sharp intake of breath. Easy, Jonas murmured, as much to himself as to her. They're just hungry. We give them reason to think we're weak, though, and hunger will override caution. The pack leader's head swiveled toward the window where Jonas watched, and for a moment, predator and man regarded each other across the moonlit clearing. In her yellow eyes, Jonas saw an intelligence that reminded him uncomfortably of human desperation, the same look he'd seen in Clara's face when he'd first found her. The wolf made her decision. She padded forward, leading her pack in a loose circle around the cabin. They were probing for weakness, looking for a way in that wouldn't require facing the fire and the armed humans within. "They're not going to give up easy," Jonas said quietly. "What do we do?" Jonas considered their options. He could try to scare them off with gunfire, but shots would carry far in the thin mountain air. If Sheriff Garrett had men in the area, the sound might bring unwanted attention. On the other hand, a pack of starving wolves was an immediate threat that required immediate action. The decision was made for him when the youngest wolf, driven by desperation, made a run at the cabin door. Jonas fired through the window, the bullet kicking up snow inches from the animal's feet. The wolf yelped and bounded back, but the pack leader held her ground, lips pulled back in a silent snarl. "That was a warning shot," Jonas said, working the rifle's lever to chamber another round. "Next one won't be." But the pack leader was beyond warnings. She charged the cabin's front wall, her powerful body slamming against the logs with enough force to make the entire structure shudder. Her claws scrabbled for purchase on the chinking between logs, and Jonas realized with cold certainty that she was trying to tear her way inside. He aimed carefully and fired. The bullet took the wolf high in the shoulder, spinning her around and dropping her in the snow. She struggled to rise, wounded but not killed, her packmates whining and circling her fallen form. "Oh God," Clara whispered, her face pale in the firelight. Jonas was already moving, checking the other windows, watching for the pack's response. Wounded wolves were dangerous, but so were the packmates who might choose vengeance over retreat. He'd seen wolf packs turn vicious when one of their own was hurt. But these wolves, driven by starvation, made a different choice. The pack leader's mate, a massive male with scars across his muzzle, approached the wounded female and touched his nose to hers in what looked almost like farewell. Then he lifted his head and howled not the hunting call Jonas was used to, but something deeper, more mournful. One by one, the other wolves joined the song, their voices rising in harmony that spoke of loss and acceptance. When the howling stopped, the pack melted back into the forest, leaving their leader bleeding in the snow. Jonas watched them go, feeling an unexpected weight in his chest. Clara moved to his side, her hand finding his arm. "You had to," she said softly. "I know." Jonas set down his rifle and moved toward the door. "But that doesn't make it easier." "Where are you going?" "To finish it. She's suffering." Clara's grip on his arm tightened. "It's too dangerous. What if the pack comes back?" Jonas looked down at her, seeing the fear in her eyes not just of the wolves, but of losing him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. When had he started mattering to her? When had she started mattering to him in ways that went beyond simple human compassion? "They won't come back," he said gently. "They made their choice, but I can't leave her out there to die slow." Clara nodded reluctantly, understanding the necessity even if she didn't like it. Jonas pulled on his coat and took his pistol, leaving the rifle with her. "If anything goes wrong, anything at all, you bar this door and don't open it for anyone but me. You understand?" "Yes." Jonas stepped out into the bitter night air, his breath forming clouds in the moonlight. The wounded wolf watched his approach with those intelligent yellow eyes, her breathing shallow and labored. There was no fear in her gaze, only a kind of resignation that reminded Jonas of soldiers he'd known, good men who'd understood when their time had come. He knelt beside her, close enough to see the intelligence in her face, the nobility that marked her as a creature perfectly suited to this harsh land. In other circumstances, he might have admired her from a distance, respected her as a fellow survivor in an unforgiving world. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and meant it. The pistol shot echoed off the mountain walls, sharp and final in the cold air. Jonas stayed kneeling for a moment, paying respects to a worthy adversary who died protecting her family. When he rose and walked back to the cabin, he carried with him the weight of necessity, another death on his conscience, even though he'd had no choice. Clara was waiting by the door, her face tight with concern. "It's done. It's done." Jonas holstered his pistol and moved to build up the fire. She was a brave one, just trying to keep her pack fed. Clara watched him work, noting the heaviness in his movements, the way his shoulders sagged as if carrying invisible weight. "You've done this before. Not just wolves-taken lives you didn't want to take." Jonas paused in his work with the fire. "Too many times. In the war, after the war, and now here. Sometimes I think the mountain called to me because it was the only place where death made sense, clean, honest, without politics or greed behind it. But this wasn't like that. No, this was just survival, hers or ours." Jonas straightened, looking at Clara in the firelight. "Which is what it'll be when Garrett comes, too. Him or us, no middle ground." Clara moved closer to the fire, and Jonas noticed she still held his spare pistol in her hand. Her grip was sure now, competent. Over the past few days, he'd watched her transform from a frightened refugee into someone capable of defending herself. The change suited her, brought out a strength he suspected had always been there, buried under the expectations of proper behavior for a schoolteacher. "Jonas," she said, not looking at him, "when this is over, assuming we survive it, I want you to know something." "What's that?" "These days with you, hiding from the world, learning to shoot and live off the land, they've been the freest I've ever felt." Clara's cheeks colored, but she pressed on. "I know it's not proper for me to say such things, but propriety nearly got me killed, or worse." Jonas felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Clara, let me finish." She turned to face him, her brown eyes reflecting the flames. "I've never felt safer than I do in this cabin with you, never felt more like myself. And I wanted you to know that, whatever happens." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities and the crackle of burning wood. Jonas found himself moving closer, drawn by something stronger than conscious thought. Clara didn't step back. Instead, she reached up and touched the scar on his left cheek, a souvenir from his army days that he'd forgotten about until her gentle fingers traced its path. "You're a good man, Jonas McCrae," she said softly. "Whatever the army says about you, whatever you believe about yourself, you're a good man." Jonas covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm against his cheek. Her skin was warm, soft, alive in a way that made him remember what it felt like to be more than just a survivor. For 23 years, he'd existed in a state of careful numbness, avoiding anything that might penetrate the walls he'd built around his heart. But Clara had slipped past those defenses without trying, simply by being herself, brave, kind, stubborn, and beautiful, in ways that went far deeper than physical appearance. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept buried for decades. "I know," she whispered. "I know it's complicated. I know we're both running from things that don't forgive or forget. But I needed you to know." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both of the harsh world beyond the cabin walls. Somewhere in that darkness, Sheriff Garrett was coming. Somewhere in their shared future lay choices that would determine whether they lived or died, whether they found peace or only more running. But for now, in the warm circle of firelight, with Clara's hand soft against his scarred face and her eyes reflecting hopes he'd thought were dead, Jonas allowed himself to believe that some things might be worth fighting for beyond mere survival. Some things might even be worth living for. The chess set appeared on their 7th evening together, as natural as if it had always been part of the cabin's sparse furnishings. Clara discovered it while organizing Jonas's few books, finding the pieces wrapped in soft leather in a wooden box behind his collection of dime novels and military histories. "You play?" she asked, unwrapping a knight carved from pale pine. Jonas looked up from where he was cleaning his rifle, a flush coloring his weathered cheeks. Whittled those during the long winters, gives a man's hands something to do besides drink. The pieces were beautiful in their simplicity, one shaped with care and attention to detail that spoke of countless solitary hours. The knights were rearing horses with flowing manes, the bishops wore robes that seemed to move in carved wood, and the king and queen bore faces that held both dignity and sorrow. "They're magnificent," Clara said, running her finger along the smooth surface of the queen. "Will you play with me?" Jonas hesitated, then set aside his rifle. "Been a long time since I played against anyone but myself." They set up the board on his handmade table, the pieces casting dancing shadows in the firelight. Jonas played methodically, like a general planning a campaign, while Clara favored bold, intuitive moves that often caught him off guard. Their first game lasted nearly 2 hours, with Jonas ultimately winning through patient positioning. "Another?" Clara asked, already resetting the pieces. "You sure? It's getting late." "I'm sure." As the nights passed, chess became their evening ritual. They would finish dinner, tend to the fire, and then settle into their respective chairs for games that grew increasingly competitive. Clara proved a quick study, adapting her natural intelligence to the strategic demands of the game. More importantly, the chess matches gave them permission to sit close together, to study each other's faces in concentration, to share the small intimacies of friendly competition. "You're thinking too hard," Jonas observed on their 10th night, watching Clara puzzle over a complex middle game position. "I'm thinking exactly hard enough," she replied, moving her bishop to threaten his queen. "Check." Jonas smiled a real smile that transformed his entire face. "Clever girl." Clara felt her heart skip at the warmth in his voice, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he looked at her. Over the past days, she'd watched Jonas slowly emerge from the shell of solitude he'd built around himself. He laughed more easily now, told stories of his mountain adventures, even hummed occasionally while he worked. The change suited him, brought out a gentleness that his harsh living conditions had nearly buried. "Jonas," she said as he contemplated his response to her check, "tell me about before the mountains, before the war. What were you like as a young man?" Jonas captured her bishop with his knight, removing the immediate threat. Young and foolish mostly, full of ideas about honor and duty that seemed a lot clearer than they turned out to be. "You were an idealist." "I was a romantic," Jonas corrected, studying the board. "Believed in causes and country, thought there was always a clear line between right and wrong. Took me 12 years of war to learn that most lines are drawn in mud and blood, and they shift with the weather." Clara moved her queen, a bold sacrifice that opened up Jonas's king. "What made you join the army?" "Family tradition, mostly. My father served in the Mexican War. His father fought at New Orleans with Jackson. McCrae's had been soldiers since we came over from Scotland." Jonas frowned at the board, seeing the trap Clara had set, but admiring the elegance of it. "I was good at it too. Had a talent for reading terrain, understanding how battles flow. Made captain by 25, major by 30. And then I started paying attention to what we were actually doing, instead of just how well we were doing it." Jonas moved his king to safety, but Clara's attack was relentless. "Hard to maintain romantic notions about military honor when you're ordered to burn out families who've never hurt anyone." Clara captured his rook with her remaining bishop. "Check again." Jonas studied the position and realized he was beaten. Clara had sacrificed material to create an unstoppable mating attacker strategy that required both tactical vision and considerable courage. "Well played," he said, tipping over his king in surrender. "My father taught me never to play it safe when the stakes matter," Clara said, then blushed as she realized the double meaning of her words. Jonas began setting up the pieces for another game, his movements careful and deliberate. "Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. A professor of philosophy at a small college in Pennsylvania, he believed that life was meant to be lived fully, with passion and conviction. Clara's voice grew wistful. "He met my mother at a lecture he gave on transcendentalism. She was the only woman in the audience, and the only one brave enough to challenge his arguments." "Sounds like her daughter." Clara smiled. Mother always said the best marriages were built on equal parts, love and friendly competition. They challenged each other constantly intellectually, morally, even at cards. But they were devoted to each other in a way that made everyone around them believe in true love. Jonas dealt the white pieces with unusual care. Must have been hard, losing them both. Cholera epidemic swept through the college town. They died within 3 days of each other. Clara's voice remained steady, but Jonas could see the old pain in her eyes. I think my father willed himself to follow her. Couldn't imagine life without his equal. Is that what you want? That kind of partnership? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Clara met his gaze across the chessboard, seeing something in his storm-grey eyes that made her pulse quicken. I used to think it was impossible, she said carefully. Fairy tales for people who didn't understand how hard life really is. But now, she gestured around the cabin, at their shared domestic space, at the quiet intimacy they'd built over games and conversations and shared dangers. Now, I think maybe my parents weren't naive. Maybe they just found something worth fighting for. Jonas's hand stilled on the white king he'd been about to place. Clara, I know what you're going to say, she interrupted. That this isn't real life, that we're just two people thrown together by circumstances, that when the danger passes, we'll remember all the reasons why this can't work. All of that's true. Maybe, but maybe it's also true that some things are worth the risk. Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. Maybe it's true that two people can find each other even in the worst circumstances and discover something neither knew they were looking for. Jonas felt the walls he'd built around his heart straining against forces he'd forgotten existed. For 23 years, he'd convinced himself that solitude was safety, that caring about nothing meant losing nothing. But Clara's presence had reawakened hungers he'd thought were buried, not just physical desire, though that was certainly part of it, but something deeper. The hunger for partnership, for someone who understood both his strengths and his failures and chose to stay anyway. You don't know all of it, he said quietly. The things I've done, the prices I've paid, the reasons why I can't go back to the world. Tell me. Jonas looked at her across the chess pieces, seeing challenge and acceptance in equal measure. Clara had already proven she wouldn't run from difficult truths. She'd fled a corrupt sheriff, survived alone in winter mountains, learned to shoot and fight and make hard choices. If anyone could handle the full story of his exile, it might be her. There was a woman, he began, his voice rough with old emotion. Before the war turned ugly, before Sand Creek changed everything, her name was Elizabeth. Clara felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, but she kept her expression neutral. Tell me about her. We met in Colorado Springs, back when I was still convinced I was one of the good ones. She was a doctor's daughter, educated, beautiful, everything a young officer thought he wanted in a wife. Jonas's hands moved restlessly among the chess pieces. I courted her properly, asked her father's permission, planned a future that included promotion and respectability and children. What happened? I was called away on campaign 6 months, chasing Cheyenne raiders through Kansas. When I came back, Elizabeth was married to a banker from Denver. Her father explained that she couldn't wait indefinitely for a soldier who might never return. Clara heard the old hurt in his voice, the wound that had never quite healed. She broke your heart. She broke my faith, Jonas corrected. In love, in promises, in the idea that anything good could survive the ugliness of what I did for a living. Made it easier to become the kind of soldier who followed orders without thinking too hard about consequences. Until Sand Creek showed me what I'd become, a man who could plan the deaths of innocents because it was militarily expedient. A man who'd lost his soul so gradually he didn't notice until it was almost too late. Clara reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. But you didn't lose it. You chose conscience over convenience, humanity over military expediency. That took more courage than following orders ever could. Jonas looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt. Clara's fingers were slender but strong, marked with small calluses from their recent survival training. They were capable hands, hands that could tend wounds or fire a weapon. Hands that belonged to a woman who understood that strength and gentleness weren't mutually exclusive. "Clara," he said, "I need you to understand something. If waif this..." He struggled for words that wouldn't sound like promises he might not be able to keep. "I can't offer you the life you deserve. I'm a wanted man living in exile. I have nothing but this cabin and whatever peace I can carve out of the wilderness." "What if that's enough?" Clara's voice was steady, sure. "What if I've discovered that I don't need respectability or security or any of the things I thought I wanted? What if all I need is a man who treats me as an equal, who challenges me to be stronger than I knew I could be, who looks at me like I'm worth fighting for?" Jonas felt something crack open inside his chest, a warmth spreading through regions that had been frozen for decades. "You are worth fighting for," he said hoarsely, "worth living for, worth risking everything for." The admission hung between them, profound in its simplicity. Outside, the wind picked up, reminding them both that danger still lurked beyond their temporary sanctuary. But inside, in the warm circle of firelight and chess pieces and shared truths, something new was being born, something that might even survive what was coming. Jonas began carving the morning after their chess confession, his hands working automatically while his mind processed everything that had changed between them. The piece of pine had been sitting on his workbench for months a section, from a tree that had fallen near his trap lines, its grain so perfect it seemed to beg for shaping. Now, under his careful knife, it was becoming something Clara would never expect. She found him at his workbench after breakfast, wood shavings curling away from his blade in delicate spirals. "What are you making?" "Something for you," Jonas said, without looking up. "A remembrance, I suppose." Clara moved closer, intrigued by the gentleness in his voice. In the growing light from the window, she could see the emerging shape, something curved and elegant, with details too fine to make out clearly. "May I see?" Jonas hesitated, then held up his work. It was a bird, a small mountain wren with wings spread in flight, every feather carved with loving precision. The piece was no larger than Clara's palm, but it captured the essence of freedom and beauty that seemed impossible to hold in mere wood. "It's beautiful," Clara breathed. "How did you learn to carve like this?" "Necessity, mostly. Long winters with nothing but time and wood, and the need to keep my hands busy." Jonas ran his thumb along the bird's wing, checking the smoothness of the curve. "But this one's different. This one matters." Clara felt her heart constrict at the quiet intensity in his voice. Over the past days, she'd watched Jonas emerge from his shell of solitude, becoming more animated and expressive with each conversation. But this was different. This was deliberate creation, beauty made manifest by hands that had known too much violence. "Why a bird?" "Because birds don't stay caged," Jonas said simply. "No matter how comfortable the cage, no matter how safe it seems, they always find a way to fly free. Reminds me of someone I know." Clara sank into the chair beside his workbench, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. In her former life as a schoolteacher, she'd received presents from grateful parents' flowers, preserves, hand-knitted scarves. But none had carried the weight of meaning she saw in Jonas's simple wooden bird. "Jonas, I need to tell you something." He looked up from his carving, noting the seriousness in her voice. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about not being able to offer me the life I deserve." Clara met his eyes steadily. "The thing is, I've had the life everyone thought I deserved, a respectable position, a nice boarding house room, the prospect of marriage to a suitable gentleman, and it nearly destroyed me." Jonas set down his knife, giving her his full attention. "The life I had was a cage, Jonas, a pretty, comfortable cage where I was expected to smile and nod and never express an opinion that might disturb anyone's peace. Where my intelligence was considered unseemly and my independence was a flaw to be corrected." Clara's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "When Sheriff Garrett decided he wanted me, everyone in town thought I should be grateful. A woman my age, unmarried, with no prospects. I should have been thankful for any offer, regardless of the source. But you weren't. I was terrified, not just of Garrett himself, but of what accepting him would mean. A lifetime of being owned rather than loved, controlled rather than cherished. I ran into these mountains because I'd rather die free than live as someone's property. Jonas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with her smooth ones. You'll never be anyone's property, Clara. Not while I'm alive to prevent it. I know, and that's exactly what I'm trying to tell you. Clara lifted their joined hands, pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. This life hiding in the mountains, learning to survive on our own terms, answering to no one but ourselves. This isn't a compromise or consolation prize. This is freedom. Jonas felt something shift deep in his chest, a fundamental realignment of everything he'd believed about his exile. For 23 years, he'd thought of his mountain solitude as punishment, necessary perhaps, but still a diminished existence compared to the life he'd lost. But Clara saw it differently. Clara saw possibility where he'd seen only penance. You really mean that? I've never meant anything more. Clara's brown eyes blazed with conviction. I don't need society's approval or civilization's comforts. I need partnership, equality, the chance to be myself without apology. And I've found all of that here, with you. Jonas studied her face, looking for any sign of uncertainty or noble self-sacrifice. But Clara's expression was clear, determined, sure of herself, in a way that took his breath away. This wasn't a woman settling for less, this was a woman choosing more than she'd ever been offered before. Clara, he said, his voice rough with emotion, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I love you, Jonas McCrae. I love your strength and your gentleness, your honor and your scars. I love the way you treat me like an equal and the way you've taught me to be braver than I knew I could be. Clara's cheeks colored, but she didn't look away. I'm saying that if you'll have me, I want to stay. Not just until the danger passes, but permanently. I want to build a life with you in these mountains. The words hit Jonas like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at this remarkable woman who'd somehow seen past all his carefully constructed barriers to the man he'd almost forgotten he could be. I love you too, he said finally, the words coming out in a rush of honesty that surprised them both. I've loved you since the second night you were here, when you insisted on helping with the cooking despite barely being able to stand. Maybe even before that, when you looked me in the eye and refused to give up your secrets without good reason. Clara's smile was radiant, transformative. Really? Really. Jonas lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. But Clara, you need to understand what you're choosing. This isn't a game or an adventure. This is a hard life in an unforgiving place, with a man who has enemies and a past that won't stay buried. I understand. Do you? Because once you make this choice, there's no going back. No returning to respectability, no changing your mind when the romance wears off and you're left with the reality of hauling water and splitting wood and wondering if every sound outside might be trouble coming. Clara stood, moving around the workbench to face him directly. Without breaking eye contact, she reached for the wooden bird he'd been carving and held it carefully in both hands. Jonas McCrae, she said formally, I, Clara Merritt, choose you. I choose this life, this place, this future we'll build together. I choose freedom over respectability, partnership over protection, love over safety. She paused, then smiled. And I choose to trust that a man who can create such beauty with his hands has more to offer than he believes. Jonas rose from his chair, overwhelmed by the certainty in her voice, the completeness of her commitment. He'd spent so many years convinced he had nothing worthwhile to offer anyone that Clara's unconditional acceptance felt like grace undeserved, but desperately needed. Clara. She silenced him by standing on her toes and pressing her lips to his, a kiss that tasted of coffee and courage and promises made without reservation. Jonas's arms came around her automatically, pulling her against him as if she might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the intimate space between intention and action. "There's something else I need to tell you," Clara said softly. "Something I found among my teaching materials that I think you should see." She moved to her small collection of belongings and withdrew something from between the pages of her schoolbook, a pressed wildflower, purple and delicate, preserved between sheets of thin paper. "Mountain lupine," Jonas recognized. "Where did you get this?" "I picked it last summer during a school picnic in the foothills. It was the first time I'd seen one, and I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever encountered." Clara held the flower up to the light, its papery petals translucent with age. "I pressed it because I wanted to remember that moment, the feeling of discovering something precious in an unexpected place." Jonas understood the metaphor, felt the truth of it resonate in his chest like a struck bell. "And now? Now I know that finding beautiful things in harsh places isn't unusual, it's the rule. The most precious discoveries happen when you're brave enough to venture beyond safe boundaries." Clara placed the pressed flower in his hands. This lupine bloomed in rocky soil at high altitude, where most plants couldn't survive. It thrived not despite the harsh conditions, but because of them. Jonas looked down at the delicate purple petals, then back at Clara's face, seeing in her expression the same wonder he'd felt that first night when she'd refused to break under pressure. "Like us," he said. "Like us." Clara's smile was soft, sure, infinitely hopeful. Two people who found each other in impossible circumstances and discovered they were exactly what the other needed. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin walls, and somewhere in the distance, danger still approached. But inside, in the warm circle of firelight and carved birds and pressed flowers, Jonas McCrae allowed himself to believe in something he'd thought was lost forever. He allowed himself to believe in love. Clara found the wanted poster while organizing Jonas's supply shelves, tucked between sacks of flour and beans, like some forgotten relic of a past he'd never mentioned. The paper was yellowed with age, but still legible, bearing a crude but recognizable sketch of a younger Jonas McCrae above bold black letters that made her blood run cold. "Wanted for desertion. Major Jonas Daniel McCrae. 3rd, Colorado Cavalry. Reward, 500 dead or alive." Clara sank onto a wooden crate, staring at the poster with trembling hands. $500 was more money than most people saw in a year, enough to motivate any number of bounty hunters to brave the mountains in search of a deserter who'd escaped justice for over 2 decades. "Find something interesting?" Jonas's voice from the doorway made Clara jump, the wanted poster crackling in her suddenly nerveless fingers. She turned to see him framed in the entrance, returning from his morning trap, run with 3 fat rabbits slung over his shoulder. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to something darker as he recognized what she held. "You never mentioned this," Clara said, her voice carefully neutral. Jonas set down his rifle and the rabbits, moving with deliberate calm to hang his coat on its peg. "Didn't seem relevant." "Didn't seem?" Clara stared at him in disbelief. "Jonas, there's a bounty on your head. $500. That's more than some men make in 2 years. I'm aware of the amount. And you didn't think to mention this. When we were planning for Sheriff Garrett, when we were talking about building a future together." Clara stood, the poster still clutched in her fist. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? Or did you think I wouldn't care?" Jonas faced her across the small cabin, his weathered features set in lines of stubborn pride. "I told you I was a deserter. I told you I'd broken my oath and run from the army. What difference does a number make? The difference is that you're not just hiding from your past, you're hiding from active pursuit. The difference is that every time you go to town for supplies, every time you interact with another human being, you're risking capture." Clara's voice rose, despite her efforts to stay calm. "The difference is that I'm not just choosing to love a recluse, I'm choosing to love a fugitive. And that changes things." Clara studied his face, seeing challenge and hurt warring in his storm-grey eyes. Jonas was testing her. She realized pushing to see if her declarations of love would survive contact with harsh reality. The knowledge made her simultaneously angry and heartbroken. "Of course it changes things," she said quietly, "but not in the way you think." Jonas's jaw tightened, as if preparing for a blow. "Then how?" Clara moved closer, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark beard. "It changes things because now I understand why you've been alone for so long. Not just because of philosophical differences with the army, but because you've been carrying this fear that anyone who gets close to you becomes a target." "Clara, let me finish." She reached up to touch his cheek, feeling him flinch slightly at the contact. "It changes things because now I realize what you've been trying to tell me all along. That loving you means accepting danger, uncertainty, the possibility that we might have to run at any moment." "Yes. And it changes things because now I'm angry furious that the army branded a good man as a criminal for refusing to participate in massacre." Clara's brown eyes blazed with indignation. "You should have been given a medal for Sand Creek, not a bounty on your head." Jonas blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "Clara, I broke my oath. I abandoned my post. By military law. By military law, you were supposed to help slaughter women and children. By any decent law, you did exactly what honor demanded." Clara stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd somehow managed to maintain, even in the wilderness. "Don't you dare apologize for choosing conscience over convenience. The army doesn't see it that way. The army was wrong. About Sand Creek, about you, about what constitutes honorable service." Clara's voice gentled, but her conviction remained absolute. "Jonas, you've spent 23 years punishing yourself for the only truly noble thing you've ever been asked to do. Don't you think that's enough?" Jonas felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, but opening. For over 2 decades, he'd carried the weight of official condemnation, the knowledge that his government considered him a criminal and a coward. He'd internalized that judgment, used it to justify his isolation and his certainty that he had nothing worthwhile to offer anyone. But Clara saw it differently. Clara saw a man who'd chosen principle over pragmatism, who'd sacrificed career and comfort and community rather than compromise his moral code. In her eyes, he wasn't a fugitive, he was a hero. "You really believe that?" he said wonderingly. "I believe in you. I believe in the man who saved my life, who taught me to survive, who carves birds for a woman he loves because he wants her to remember freedom." Clara's hand slid down to rest over his heart. "I believe in the man who'd rather live in exile than participate in evil." Jonas covered her hand with his own, feeling the steady rhythm of his pulse against her palm. "Even knowing what it means? Even understanding that choosing me means choosing a life outside the law?" "Especially understanding that." Clara's smile was fierce, transformative. "Jonas, do you know what I was before I met you? I was a good girl. A proper lady who followed all the rules, who never questioned authority, who believed that respectability mattered more than authenticity. And now I'm a woman who can shoot straight and think for herself and recognize that sometimes the most moral choice is the illegal one." Clara rose on her toes, bringing her face level with his. "You didn't corrupt me, Jonas McCrae. You freed me." The kiss that followed was different from their gentle exploration of the previous night, hungrier, more urgent, charged with the electricity of mutual recognition. Jonas's arms came around Clara with desperate strength, as if he could pull her inside his skin and keep her safe from all the dangers their love would bring. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the intimate space between desire and decision. "Clara," Jonas said hoarsely, "if we do this, if we commit to each other knowing what we know, there's no going back. You'll be as wanted as I am, an accessory, a fugitive's woman. They'll hunt you too." "Good," Clara said fiercely. "Let them try. I'm done being respectable, Jonas. I'm done caring what small-minded people think about my choices. I'd rather be hunted for something real than praised for something empty." Jonas stared at her, overwhelmed by her certainty, her courage, her absolute refusal to be intimidated by consequences. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Clara's hands framed his face, her thumbs tracing the high ridge of his cheekbones. "I love you, Jonas McCrae. Not despite your fugitive status, but including it. All of it. The honor that got you exiled, the strength that kept you alive, the loneliness that taught you to value connection." "I love you too," Jonas said, the words coming easier now, weighted with wonder rather than fear. "More than I thought possible, more than I deserved." "More than you believed you could," Clara corrected. "There's a difference." They stood together in the afternoon light, streaming through the cabin windows, holding each other as if they could stop time through sheer force of will. Outside, the mountain wind carried the promise of more weather, more challenges, more tests of their newfound commitment. But inside, two people who'd thought themselves beyond hope had found something worth any risk. A partnership built on mutual recognition, respect, and the radical acceptance of flawed humanity. They were both fugitives now, both outside the law's protection. And somehow that felt exactly right. "So, what do we do now?" Clara asked. Jonas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Now we get ready for Sheriff Garrett, and after we deal with him, we start planning our life together. Our life as outlaws. Our life as free people who answer to conscience instead of convention." Jonas pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "Think you can handle that, schoolteacher?" Clara's answering smile was pure mischief. "Try me, soldier." Outside, storm clouds gathered over the peaks, and somewhere in the distance, danger approached on horseback. But inside the cabin, two people who'd been running from different pasts had found something worth standing and fighting for. They'd found each other. Spring arrived like a slow-burning fuse, each day bringing slightly longer daylight and the sound of snow sliding off the cabin roof in wet, heavy sheets. Jonas could feel the change in his bones, the subtle shift in air pressure, the different quality of light that told him the mountain passes would be clear within days. Time was running out. He stood at the window with his morning coffee, watching the tree line for movement, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Beside him, Clara cleaned his father's hunting knife with methodical precision, the blade gleaming in the pale sunlight. The knife was the last gift his father had given him before Jonas left for the Warra piece of family history that had seen 3 generations of McCrae men through dangerous times. "Tell me about this," Clara said, running her thumb along the carved bone handle. "My father carried it at Buena Vista, his father at New Orleans with Andrew Jackson, been in the family for almost 60 years. Jonas set down his coffee and took the knife, feeling its familiar weight. "It's made for close work, the kind of fighting that happens when everything else has failed." Clara studied the weapon with the same intensity she brought to everything now. No longer the sheltered schoolteacher who'd stumbled into his clearing, but a woman who understood that survival sometimes required terrible choices. "You think it will come to that?" "Maybe. Garrett's not the type to give up easy, and cornered men do desperate things." Jonas slid the knife into the sheath he wore at his belt. "But we've got advantages he doesn't know about. This is my territory, my mountain. I know every trail, every hiding place, every way the wind carries sound." They'd spent the past week preparing for war-checking weapons, stockpiling ammunition, planning escape routes through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain men. Jonas had shown Clara how to move silently through snow, how to read tracks and weather signs, how to make a fire that produced no smoke. She absorbed it all, with the focused determination of someone who understood her life, depended on the knowledge. "How many men will he bring?" Clara asked, moving to join Jonas at the window. 5, maybe 6. Can't afford to leave his town completely unprotected, but he'll bring enough to make sure I can't fight my way out." Jonas pointed toward the southern approach, where the main trail switched backed up through dense timber. "They'll come that way. It's the only route that makes sense for horses carrying supplies. And if they split up, then we deal with them in pieces instead of all at once." Jonas's voice carried the calm certainty of a man who'd fought outnumbered before and survived. "The mountain will help us. Weather's still unpredictable this time of year, and city men don't understand how fast conditions can change at altitude." Clara nodded, but Jonas could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand kept drifting to the pistol at her hip. She'd proven herself capable during their daily practice sessions, but target shooting was different from combat. When men started dying, everything changed. "Clara," he said gently, "you know I have to scare you sure about this. Really sure, because once the shooting starts, there's no taking it back. You'll have blood on your hands, same as me." Clara turned from the window to face him, her brown eyes steady and sure. "Jonas McCrae, I watched that man murder a federal marshal in cold blood. I felt his hands around my throat, heard him describe exactly what he planned to do to me after I became his wife. If killing him is what it takes to be free, then I'll live with the blood." Jonas searched her face for any sign of doubt or bravado, but found only calm resolution. The transformation was remarkable, less than 2 weeks. Clara had evolved from victim to warrior, finding strength she'd never known she possessed. "All right then. But remember what I taught, you don't hesitate when the moment comes. Hesitation gets you killed." "I won't hesitate." Jonas believed her. Clara had already proven she could make hard choices when survival was at stake. The question wasn't whether she had the courage to fight it, was whether either of them would live through what was coming. A sound from outside made them both freeze, the distant crack of a branch breaking under weight, carried on the thin mountain air. Jonas held up a hand for silence, moving to the window with practiced stealth. For several minutes, they waited and listened, but the sound wasn't repeated. "False alarm," Jonas said finally. "Probably just snow sliding off a tree, but it won't be long now." Clara moved to their supply cache, checking the bandages and medicines they'd prepared for the inevitable wounds. "When it's over," she said without looking at him, "what then? Even if we win, there will be questions. Bodies to explain. Other lawmen who might come looking." Jonas had been thinking about the same problem. "Depends on what we find when we search the bodies. If Garrett was involved in federal crimes like we suspect, there might be evidence we can use. Letters, orders, something that explains why a U.S. Marshal was killed. And if there isn't, then we disappear, head north into the real wilderness, find a place where no one will think to look." Jonas met her eyes. "I know country up there that hasn't seen white men since the fur trappers left. We could build a life, just the two of us." Clara nodded slowly. The prospect of complete isolation should have been terrifying, but instead she felt a flutter of excitement. Life with Jonas in the deep wilderness would be challenging, dangerous, requiring every skill they could master. It would also be free from all the social constraints and expectations that had nearly destroyed her. "That doesn't sound like punishment," she said. "That sounds like paradise." Jonas smiled, the expression lighting up his weathered features. "That's what I'm hoping you'll think. Paradise built by our own hands, answerable to no one but ourselves." The afternoon brought the first real test of their defenses. Jonas was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard the Shota single rifle crack echoing off the canyon walls, followed by the distinctive whistle of a ricochet. Someone was testing their range, trying to gauge how well defended the cabin might be. Jonas dropped his axe and sprinted for the cabin, bursting through the door to find Clara already at the window with his spare rifle, scanning the tree line for movement. "Southeast ridge," she said without taking her eyes from the site. "Maybe 400 yards. I saw muzzle flash." Jonas grabbed his own rifle and moved to the opposite window, admiring Clara's calm competence under pressure. "Just one shot?" "So far. But there's movement in the trees, at least 3 men, maybe more." Jonas studied the terrain through his rifle scope, picking out the subtle signs of human presence among the pine boughs. A flash of color that didn't belong, the unnatural movement of branches in still air, the faint glint of sunlight on metal. His count matched Clara's 3 men visible, which meant at least 2 more were positioned where they couldn't be seen. "They're probing," he said. "Testing our response time, trying to figure out how many guns we have." "Do we shoot back?" Not yet. Let them wonder. Jonas moved away from the window, keeping low. They know we're here, but they don't know our capabilities. Better to keep them guessing until they commit to an attack. For the next hour, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse. The attackers would show themselves briefly, draw aim, then disappear back into cover before Jonas or Clara could get a clear shot. It was psychological warfare-ian attempt to fray their nerves and force them into making mistakes. "They're trying to make us panic," Jonas explained during a lull in the probing. "Get us to waste ammunition or abandon our defensive positions. It's a sound tactic against amateurs." "But we're not amateurs." "No, we're not." Jonas checked his rifle loads for the 10th time, the mechanical action soothing his combat nerves. "You're doing good, Clara. Better than some soldiers I've known." Clara felt a warm glow of pride at his words. The frightened woman who'd fled into the mountains seemed like a different person, now someone weak and helpless who no longer existed. In her place was someone harder, more capable, someone who could face armed men without flinching. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and crimson, the probing attack stopped. Jonas knew this was the dangerous time, the transition from daylight to darkness, when attackers had maximum advantage and defenders were most vulnerable. "They'll come tonight," he said, banking the fire until it produced more heat than light. "Probably in the hours before dawn, when we're most likely to be asleep." Clara nodded, checking her pistol one final time before settling into the chair by the window. "I'll take first watch." "Clara." "I can do this, Jonas. I need to do this." Her voice carried quiet conviction. "These men killed a federal marshal and would have forced me into marriage or worse. I won't cower in the corner while you fight my battles." Jonas looked at her in the dim firelight, hair pulled back in a practical bun, gun belt settled comfortably around her waist, eyes alert and determined. She was magnificent, he realized. Not despite the danger, but because of how she'd risen to meet it. "All right," he said, "but we do this together. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We have the advantage of position and knowledge. We use those advantages and stay alive." "Together," Clara agreed. As full darkness fell over the mountains, they settled into their vigil. Jonas dozed fitfully in his chair, ears attuned to every sound from outside. Clara kept watch at the window, rifle ready, eyes scanning the tree line for movement that didn't belong. Around midnight, she woke Jonas with a gentle touch on his shoulder. "I think I saw something," she whispered, "northwest corner near the woodpile." Jonas moved to join her at the window, peering into the darkness. For several minutes, nothing moved. Then he saw Ita's shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows around the shed, moving with the careful stealth of a man trying not to be seen. "One man," Jonas breathed. "Reconnaissance probably, checking our defenses before the main attack." They watched the shadow circle the cabin at a careful distance, noting the locations of windows and doors, probably counting the number of rifles visible inside. After 20 minutes, the figure melted back into the forest, leaving no trace of his presence except the knowledge that they were being watched. "How long?" Clara asked. "Soon. They know what they need to know now." Jonas moved to his supply cache, pulling out additional ammunition and distributing it between their fighting positions. "The next time we see movement, it won't be reconnaissance." Clara checked her weapons one final time, then moved to the small mirror Jonas used for shaving. In its reflection, she saw a stranger, someone harder, more determined, with eyes that had seen too much to ever be truly innocent again. The transformation should have frightened her, but instead she felt a fierce satisfaction. This was who she was meant to be, not a victim, but a survivor. "Jonas," she said softly, "whatever happens in the next few hours, I want you to know something." "What's that?" "I'm not sorry. About any of it. About running away. About finding you. About choosing this life over the safe one." Clara turned from the mirror to face him. "Even if we don't survive tonight, I'm not sorry." Jonas crossed the cabin in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms with desperate intensity. "We're going to survive," he said fiercely. "Both of us. We're going to win this fight and build that life in the wilderness and grow old together watching sunsets from our own front porch." Clara kissed him then, pouring all her love and determination into the contact. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, fortified by the connection between them. "Promise me something," Clara said. "Anything. Promise me that if something happens to Maeve, I fall or get captured, you won't do anything stupid trying to save me. You'll escape, survive, live the life we planned." Jonas's jaw tightened. "Clara, promise me, Jonas. I need to know that my death won't be meaningless, that it won't destroy the man I love." Jonas stared at her for a long moment, seeing the steel beneath her gentle exterior, the core of strength that had carried her through impossible circumstances. "I promise," he said finally, "but only if you promise the same thing. Deal?" They shook hands solemnly, sealing a pact that both hoped they'd never have to honor. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of more weather. Somewhere in the darkness, armed men were making their final preparations for an assault that would determine the fate of two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances. Jonas McCrae checked his rifle one last time and settled into position by the window. Beside him, Clara Merritt's schoolteacher turned warrior did the same. They were ready for whatever came next. The mountain held its breath, waiting for dawn. They came with the grey light of dawn, moving like ghosts through the morning mist that clung to the mountain valleys. Jonas spotted them first, 5 men on horseback, picking their way up the switchback trail, their movements careful and coordinated. Sheriff Garrett rode in the center, his bulk unmistakable even at distance, flanked by hard-faced men who carried their weapons with professional competence. 5 riders, Jonas reported quietly, never taking his eye from the rifle scope. No sign of the 6th man, which means he's already in position somewhere we can't see him. Clara nodded from her position at the south window, her own rifle trained on the approaching group. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled. The nervous schoolteacher had been replaced by someone Jonas barely recognized. Range? 800 yards and closing. There'll be an effective rifle range in about 10 minutes. Jonas made small adjustments to his position, calculating angles and distances with the automatic precision of long experience. "Remember what I taught you about leading targets. These aren't stationary tin cans." "I remember." The riders paused at the bottom of the final approach, clustering together in apparent conference. Through his scope, Jonas could see Garrett gesturing toward the cabin, his mouth moving in what were probably orders. The other men nodded, then began to spread out not the random positioning of amateurs, but the deliberate deployment of men who understood small unit tactics. "They know what they're doing," Jonas observed grimly. "Garrett's got himself some professional help. Bounty hunters? Maybe. Or ex-soldiers looking for work." Jonas tracked one of the flanking riders as he disappeared into the timber on the cabin's left side. "Either way, they're not going to make this easy." A voice boomed across the clearing, amplified by the thin mountain air and the natural acoustics of the canyon walls. "McCrae! Jonas McCrae! I know you're in there!" Jonas and Clara exchanged glances but didn't respond. There was nothing to be gained by conversation and everything to be lost by revealing their exact positions. "I'm Sheriff Tom Garrett from Millerville," the voice continued. "I'm here on official business, pursuing a fugitive and recovering stolen property." Clara's jaw tightened at being referred to as property, but she kept her rifle sights steady on the mounted figure in the center of the group. "Send out the woman, McCrae, and we can discuss terms. No need for anyone to get hurt over a misunderstanding." Jonas almost smiled at the transparent lie. Men like Garrett didn't ride this far into hostile territory to negotiate. They came to take what they wanted by force. The attempted parley was just another tactic, designed to make the defenders reveal themselves or lower their guard. "You've got 1 minute to think about it," Garrett shouted. "After that we come in shooting." The minutes stretched out like an hour, filled with the sounds of horses stamping and leather creaking as the attackers adjusted their positions. Jonas used the time to make final preparations, extra ammunition within easy reach, escape routes mentally rehearsed, firing angles calculated and recalculated. Beside him, Clara appeared calm as still water, but Jonas could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on her rifle. This was her first real battle, and despite all their preparation, there was no way to know how someone would react when the bullets started flying. "Clara," he said softly, "whatever happens, remember that I love you. Remember that you're the best thing that ever happened to me." She turned to look at him, her brown eyes bright with unshed tears and fierce determination. "I love you too, Jonas McCrae. Now let's show these bastards what happens when they threaten our home." The attack began without warning, not with Garrett's threatened frontal assault, but with the sharp crack of a rifle from the timber to their left. The bullet shattered the window beside Jonas's head, spraying glass across the cabin floor and confirming what he'd suspected: the missing sixth man had worked his way into flanking position during the night. "Sniper in the trees," Jonas called out, dropping below window level and combat, crawling toward the rear of the cabin. "Southwest, maybe 200 yards. Clara shifted position smoothly, bringing her rifle to bear on the new threat, while Jonas covered the main approach. It was a textbook defensive maneuver, executed with the kind of coordination that spoke of hours of practice and natural partnership. The sniper fired again, his bullet punching through the cabin's log wall just inches from Clara's head. Splinters exploded inward, but she didn't flinch, instead tracking toward the muzzle flash she'd glimpsed in the forest shadows. "Got him," she breathed, and squeezed the trigger. Her shot was followed immediately by a cry of pain and the crash of a falling body. Not a killing shot, perhaps, but enough to put the sniper out of action. Jonas felt a fierce pride in Clara's marksmanship, mixed with the cold satisfaction of a tactical problem solved. "Nice shooting," he said, then refocused on the main threat as Garrett's remaining men spurred their horses toward the cabin. The frontal assault was everything Jonas had expected: brutal, direct, and professionally executed. The four riders came in a loose line, firing from horseback with practiced skill while using their mount's speed to make themselves difficult targets. It was a tactic that had worked countless times against isolated homesteaders and unprepared defenders. But Jonas McCrae was neither isolated nor unprepared. His first shot took the leftmost rider in the chest, spinning him from his saddle to land motionless in the snow. His second shot wounded one of the horses, sending its rider tumbling as the animal screamed and thrashed in pain and fear. Clara's rifle spoke twice in rapid succession, her bullets finding their marks with deadly precision. One man clutched his shoulder and wheeled his horse away, blood streaming between his fingers. The other tried to return fire, but found his rifle empty at the crucial moment. In less than 30 seconds, Garrett's coordinated assault had been reduced to chaos. 2 men were down, one was wounded and retreating, and only the sheriff himself remained in position to continue the attack. But Garrett wasn't finished. As his surviving companion fled toward the timber, the corrupt lawman dismounted and took cover behind a fallen log, his rifle already seeking targets in the cabin windows. His first shot narrowly missed Jonas, the bullet embedding itself in the cabin's rear wall with a solid thunk. "He's good," Jonas admitted grudgingly, impressed despite himself by Garrett's marksmanship and tactical sense. "This isn't going to be easy." For the next several minutes, they traded shots with the sheriff, a deadly game of patience and precision played at ranges where a single mistake meant death. Garrett had chosen his position well, protected by the massive log, while commanding clear fields of fire toward both cabin windows. "I can't get a clean shot," Clara reported, frustration evident in her voice. "He's got too much cover." Jonas studied the tactical situation with the calculating mind of a professional soldier. Garrett was well positioned, but also trapped. He couldn't advance without exposing himself, but he also couldn't retreat without turning his back on accurate rifle fire. It was a stalemate that could only be broken by movement or superior firepower. "Keep him pinned down," Jonas decided. "I'm going to circle around and take him from the side." "Jonas, no. It's the only way." He's got us pinned here, and sooner or later he'll get lucky or we'll run out of ammunition." Jonas was already moving toward the cabin's rear door, checking his pistol and knife. "Just keep shooting. Make him think we're both still inside." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to find another solution that didn't involve Jonas exposing himself to enemy fire. But she understood tactical reality, as well as he did sometimes. The only way out of a trap was through it. "Be careful," she said simply. Jonas paused at the door, looking back at the woman who'd transformed his life in less than 2 weeks. "I'll be back," he promised. "We've got a future to build together." Then he was gone, slipping out into the morning air with the silence and skill that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous living. Behind him, Clara's rifle continued its steady rhythm, each shot perfectly placed to keep Garrett's attention focused on the cabin windows. The final confrontation was about to begin. Jonas moved through the timber like a ghost, his decades of mountain living serving him well as he circled toward Garrett's position. Snow muffled his footsteps, and the natural cover of pine boughs concealed his movement from the sheriff's increasingly desperate attempts to spot both defenders. Behind him, Clara's rifle maintained its steady cadence, each shot carefully placed to keep Garrett pinned behind his log fortification. She was doing exactly what Jonas had asked, making the sheriff believe both defenders were still in the cabin, while giving Jonas the time and distraction he needed to reach flanking position. Old Thunder felt familiar in Jonas's hands as he settled into position behind a massive pine, his rifle's worn stock pressed against his cheek with the comfort of long partnership. The weapon had seen him through countless dangers over the year-shunting expeditions that had turned deadly, encounters with claim jumpers and desperados, the constant small wars that came with frontier living. Now it would serve him one last time, in defense of the only woman he'd ever truly loved. Through his rifle scope, Jonas could see Garrett clearly for the first time. The sheriff was a big man, thick through the shoulders and chest. With the kind of brutal face that suggested violence was his natural answer to most problems. His eyes moved constantly, searching for targets, and his rifle handling showed the competence of someone who'd killed before and expected to kill again. But Garrett had made a crucial mistake. He'd become so focused on the cabin windows that he'd forgotten to watch his flanks. It was the kind of error that got men killed in situations like this, and Jonas was prepared to take full advantage of it. "Garrett," Jonas called out, his voice carrying clearly across the 50 yards that separated them. "Sheriff Tom Garrett." The corrupt lawman spun toward the sound, his rifle swinging around with desperate speed. But Jonas was already moving, shifting position even as he called out, using voice projection techniques learned during his cavalry days to mask his exact location. "You made 2 mistakes coming here," Jonas continued, his voice now coming from a different angle. "First mistake was thinking you could take something that doesn't belong to you." Garrett fired toward the sound of Jonas's voice, his bullet splintering bark from a tree 6 feet to the left of Jonas's actual position. The sheriff worked his rifle's lever action with mechanical precision, chambering another round while scanning the forest for his tormentor. "Second mistake was thinking I'd let you leave alive after threatening the woman I love." This time Garrett spun completely around, trying to track Jonas's voice as it seemed to come from yet another direction. His face was flushed with anger and growing desperation. He was losing control of the tactical situation, and he knew it. "McCrae," Garrett shouted, "you're a dead man. You and your whore both." The words hit Jonas like a physical blow, igniting a rage he hadn't felt since his army days. Men could threaten him, insult him, even try to kill him, and he could maintain professional detachment. But no one spoke about Clara that way and lived. Jonas rose from cover with fluid grace, his rifle already shouldered and aimed. Garrett saw the movement and tried to bring his own weapon to bear, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. Jonas's first shot took the sheriff in the right shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. Garrett staggered but didn't fall, his left hand clawing for the pistol at his hip. He was tough, Jonas had to give him that most men would have been finished by a rifle bullet to the shoulder. But Garrett was driven by the kind of desperate fury that could keep a man fighting even with mortal wounds. Jonas worked his rifle's lever and fired again, this shot taking Garrett in the leg and dropping him to his knees in the snow. The sheriff's pistol cleared leather just as Jonas's third shot shattered his gun hand, sending the weapon spinning away into the underbrush. "It's over, Garrett," Jonas said, approaching with careful steps, his rifle still trained on the wounded man. "You're finished." Garrett glared up at him through eyes bright with pain and hatred. "You think killing me solves anything? There'll be others coming. Bounty hunters, federal marshals, men who won't give up as easy as you think. Maybe, but they won't be coming for Clara. She's done nothing but refuse to be your victim." Jonas stopped, just out of arm's reach, studying the man who'd caused so much suffering. "The marshal you killed, what was he investigating?" "Go to hell." Jonas's rifle muzzle drifted lower, centering on Garrett's chest. "I asked you a question." Something in Jonas's voice must have convinced Garrett that he was out of options. "Land fraud," he said finally. "Hendricks was looking into territorial land grants, claims that didn't match the paperwork. Stupid bastard got too close to the truth." "What truth?" "That half the land grants in 3 counties were forged. That me and Judge Morrison and a few others had been selling territorial land that belonged to the federal government." Garrett's laugh was bitter, pained. "Thousands of acres, hundreds of thousands of dollars, worth killing for." Jonas nodded grimly. It was exactly what he'd suspected, federal crime on a scale that would have brought serious attention from Washington. Hendricks hadn't been passing through Millerville by accident. He'd been conducting a criminal investigation that had gotten him murdered. "Where's the evidence? Documents, letters, proof of what you've been doing?" "Safe in Morrison's office. But it won't matter now. With me dead, they'll burn everything and disappear. You've accomplished nothing, McCrae." Jonas was about to respond when he heard Clara's voice, calling his name from the direction of the cabin. Something in her tone, urgency mixed with fear, made him turn toward the sound. It was the distraction Garrett had been waiting for. Despite his wounds, the sheriff lunged forward with surprising speed, a hidden knife gleaming in his left hand. The blade slashed toward Jonas's throat with deadly intent, driven by the last desperate strength of a dying man. But Jonas McCrae had survived too many battles to be caught by such an obvious ruse. He sidestepped the attack with fluid grace, bringing his rifle butt around in a crushing blow that caught Garrett in the temple. The sheriff collapsed like a felled tree, his knife spinning away harmlessly into the snow. "Jonas!" Clara's voice was closer now, filled with relief and urgent concern. "Are you all right? I heard shots." "I'm fine," Jonas called back, nudging Garrett's motionless form with his boot. The sheriff was still breathing, but barely the rifle butt had done its work efficiently. "It's over, Clara. It's finished." Clara appeared through the trees, her rifle still ready, despite the obvious conclusion of the fight. She took in the scene with quick, intelligent eyes. Garrett unconscious and bleeding in the snow. Jonas standing over him with grim satisfaction. The scattered weapons that told the story of the brief but violent encounter. "Is he dead?" she asked. "Not yet, but close." Jonas checked Garrett's wounds professionally. The shoulder and leg were serious but not immediately fatal, but the head injury was another matter entirely. "He's got maybe an hour, maybe less." Clara felt no sympathy for the man who'd murdered a federal marshal and tried to force her into marriage. "Good," she said simply. They dragged Garrett back to the cabin, not out of mercy, but out of practical necessity. They needed to search his belongings and question him about the land fraud scheme while he was still conscious. The other attackers were dead or fled, leaving only the sheriff to provide the answers they needed. As they worked, Clara noticed the change in Jonas, the way he moved, with deadly efficiency, the cold calculation in his eyes, as he assessed wounds and possibilities. This was the soldier he'd once been, she realized, the professional killer who'd served his country for 12 years before conscience forced him into exile. "You're frightening when you're like this," she said as they settled Garrett against the cabin wall. Jonas looked up from his examination of the sheriff's wounds, seeing something like awe in Clara's expression. "Does that bother you?" "No," Clara said, surprising them both. "It makes me feel safe. It makes me understand why you survived 23 years alone in these mountains." She paused, then added quietly, "It makes me proud to be your woman." Jonas felt warmth spread through his chest at her words. Even seeing him at his most dangerous, Clara didn't shrink away or question her choice. If anything, she seemed more certain than ever that they belonged together. "We need to search the bodies," Jonas said practically. "Look for documents, letters, anything that might prove what Garrett told us about the land fraud. If we can find evidence, we might be able to clear both our names." Clara nodded, understanding the implications. If they could prove that Garrett and his associates had committed federal crimes, it might be possible to negotiate with the authorities Jonas's desertion charges balanced against his assistance in uncovering a major criminal conspiracy. It was a slim hope, but it was more hope than either of them had possessed an hour earlier. As they began their grim task, searching the pockets of dead men in the growing mountain sunlight, neither Jonas nor Clara spoke about the transformation they'd both witnessed. Clara had seen the soldier Jonas had been, the lethal competence that had made him valuable to the army. Jonas had seen Clara under ultimate pressure, calm and deadly, and absolutely committed to their shared survival. They were partners now in the truest sense, not just lovers, but allies who'd been tested in the crucible of combat and emerged stronger than either had been alone. The mountain wind carried away the smoke from their rifles, leaving only the silence of aftermath and the promise of whatever came next. 6 months later, Jonas stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching Clara tend the small garden she'd planted in the meadow below. Summer had transformed the mountain landscape into something almost pastoral. Wildflowers carpeted the slopes in brilliant purple and gold, and the creek ran full and clear from snowmelt higher up. It was hard to believe this peaceful scene had been the setting for such violence just half a year before. Clara looked up from her work, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and waved. The gesture was so natural, so domestic, that Jonas felt his chest tighten with an emotion he still wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging. Love, he'd discovered, was more terrifying than any battle he'd ever fought, more rewarding too, but infinitely more fragile. "Dinner in an hour," Clara called, her voice carrying easily across the meadow. "And don't forget the preacher will be here tomorrow." Jonas smiled, touching the small wooden box in his shirt pocket. Inside was the ring he'd been working on for weeks, carved from mountain silver he'd found in an old mine shaft, polished to a soft gleam that caught the light like captured starfire. Tomorrow, Clara Merritt would become Clara McCrae, and Jonas would finally have something he'd never thought he deserved. The legal situation had resolved itself more easily than either of them had dared hope. Garrett's belongings had yielded a treasure trove of incriminating documents, letters detailing the land fraud scheme, forged territorial grants, even correspondence with corrupt officials in Denver and Washington. When Jonas had ridden to the nearest federal marshal's office with the evidence, he'd found men who were very interested in prosecuting a conspiracy that had cost the government hundreds of thousands of dollars. His desertion charges had been quietly dropped in exchange for his cooperation in the investigation. The official record now showed that Major Jonas McCrae had been operating as a deep-cover federal agent for the past 23 years, a fiction that amused Jonas but served everyone's purposes. Clara's name had been cleared as well, her status changed from fugitive to witness under federal protection. They could have returned to civilization if they'd wanted. Jonas had been offered a position with the Territorial Marshal's Service, and Clara had received inquiries from several schools looking for experienced teachers. But when the dust settled and all the paperwork was filed, they'd looked at each other and made the same choice they'd made in the depths of winter. They chose freedom over respectability, partnership over convention, love over safety. The cabin bore little resemblance to the Spartan shelter Jonas had inhabited alone. Clara's influence was everywhere, curtains at the windows, books arranged on proper shelves, a kitchen garden that would provide vegetables through the harsh winter months. She'd even convinced him to build a proper schoolhouse in the clearing where she taught the children of the few families who'd settled in the valley below. "The circuit preacher's coming up the trail," Clara announced as Jonas joined her in the garden. "Looks like he brought company." Jonas shaded his eyes, picking out the small party winding up the mountain path. Reverend Patterson rode in front, his familiar black hat visible even at distance. Behind him came two other Redursa man and woman Jonas didn't recognize, probably new settlers looking for the teacher or the healer Clara had become known as. "Think they'll stay for the wedding?" Clara asked, brushing dirt from her hands. "Probably. Patterson never misses a chance to perform a ceremony, and new folks in the valley are always curious about the hermit and the school teacher." Jonas put his arm around Clara's waist, marveling as always at how perfectly she fit against him. "You nervous? About getting married?" "Not at all." Clara leaned into his embrace, solid and warm and real. "About cooking for unexpected guests?" "Terrified." Jonas laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. Clara had many talents, but cooking for large groups wasn't among them. "I'll handle the cooking. You just worry about looking beautiful." "That's not very progressive of you, Mr. McCrae." "Mrs. McCrae," Jonas corrected, then added more seriously, "I want you to be happy, Clara. I want this life to be everything you hoped it would be." Clara turned in his arms, studying his weathered face with eyes that saw everything, the scars and the strength, the tenderness and the steel. "Jonas McCrae, 6 months ago I was a frightened woman running from a forced marriage. Today I'm about to marry the man I love, in the place I've chosen to call home, surrounded by people who respect me for who I am, rather than what they think I should be." She reached up to touch his cheek. "I've never been happier in my life." The wedding took place the next morning in the meadow, where Clara's garden grew, with the entire population of the small valley in attendance, maybe 20 people in all, counting children. Reverend Patterson performed the ceremony with the rolling eloquence that had made him legendary throughout the territory, his words carrying extra weight in the thin mountain air. Jonas wore his best shirt and the pants Clara had mended with careful stitches, while Clara had somehow managed to create a wedding dress from white fabric she'd ordered from Denver. She was radiant in the morning sunlight, her dark hair crowned with wildflowers, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that couldn't be manufactured or faked. When Patterson asked if they had rings, Jonas produced the band he'd carved from mountain silver, its surface smooth as silk and warm from his pocket. Clara gasped when she saw it not at its beauty, though it was beautiful, but at the inscription Jonas had painstakingly etched around the inner surface. "Forever free," she read, her voice thick with emotion. "Forever free," Jonas agreed, sliding the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly. Together. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle, reverent, witnessed by mountain peaks that had stood for millennia and would stand for millennia more. When they broke apart, both were crying tears of joy, relief, and the overwhelming gratitude of two people who'd found each other against impossible odds. The celebration continued through the afternoon, with food and music and the kind of simple pleasures that came from community built on mutual respect rather than social convention. Children played in the meadow, while adults shared stories and songs, the sound of laughter carrying far into the wilderness beyond. As evening approached and the guests began to make their way back down the mountain, Jonas and Clara stood together on their porch, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. The cabin glowed golden in the dying light, looking more like a home than a refuge for the first time since Jonas had built it. "Any regrets?" Jonas asked, echoing the question Clara had asked him months earlier. "Only one," Clara said seriously. Jonas felt his heart skip. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me 26 years to find you." Clara's smile was radiant, transformative. "I regret all the time we lost before we found each other." Jonas pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of wildflowers in her hair, feeling the steady rhythm of her pulse against his chest. "We've got the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." "The rest of our lives." Clara agreed. Growing old together in these mountains, teaching children who'll never know what it's like to be told they're not good enough, watching sunsets from our own front porch, building something that lasts, building something that matters. As full darkness settled over the mountain valley, Jonas and Clara McCrae went inside their home, no longer a bachelor's refuge or a temporary shelter, but a place where two people had chosen to build a life based on mutual respect, shared challenges, and love that had been tested in the crucible of violence and emerged stronger than ever. Outside, the wind sang through the pine trees, carrying the promise of winter storms and spring renewals, of seasons yet to come and years yet to be lived. But inside, in the warm circle of firelight and domestic contentment, time seemed to slow and settle into something approaching peace. Jonas McCrae, former cavalry major and 23-year exile, had finally found what he hadn't known he was looking for. Clara McCrae, former schoolteacher and reluctant fugitive, had discovered that the most profound freedom came not from escaping constraints, but from choosing them with someone who understood that love was both a sanctuary and an adventure. They sat together by the fire, as they had so many nights before, but now with the added weight of spoken vows and shared promises. Clara's wedding ring caught the firelight as she reached for Jonas's hand, the silver band gleaming like a small star against her skin. "Tell me something," Clara said as they settled into their evening ritual. "That first night, when you found me in the snow, did you know?" "Know what?" "That everything was about to change, that the life you'd built was about to be turned upside down by a half-frozen woman who didn't even know your name." Jonas considered the question seriously, remembering that bitter February night when he'd discovered Clara unconscious in the snow. "I knew something was different," he said finally. "I'd found injured people before, helped them, sent them on their way without thinking much about it. But with you," he paused, searching for the right words. "With you, I knew from the moment I saw you that my life was about to get complicated. And you saved me anyway." "I saved myself," Jonas corrected gently. "I just didn't realize it at the time." Clara laughed, the sound warm and rich in the quiet cabin. "My romantic hero, always so practical. Someone has to be practical in this family. You're the dreamer. I'm the one who makes sure we don't starve while you're planning your next educational revolution." It was true, Jonas reflected. Clara's school had already gained a reputation throughout the territory for its unconventional methods and remarkable results. She taught reading and writing alongside practical skills like hunting and herbalism, producing students who could quote Shakespeare and track deer with equal facility. Parents rode for days to enroll their children with the mountain schoolteacher who treated education as preparation for real life rather than mere social polish. Speaking of which, Clara said, "I've been thinking about next year, about expanding the school, maybe building a proper schoolhouse with dormitories for children whose families live too far away for daily travel." Jonas smiled, recognizing the tone in her voice. Clara's educational ambitions had been growing steadily since spring, fed by her success with the local children and the steady stream of families moving into the valley. "How many students are we talking about?" "Maybe 20, 25, enough to justify a real teaching staff, someone for the older children, someone for the younger ones, maybe even someone who specializes in practical skills." "Sounds expensive." "Sounds necessary." Clara's eyes blazed with the fervor that had first attracted Jonas to her, passionate conviction that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. These children deserve better than the scattered, inferior education they're getting now. They deserve teachers who see their potential instead of their limitations. Jonas nodded, already mentally calculating the costs and logistics involved in Clara's vision. It would require careful planning, significant investment, and probably some negotiation with territorial authorities. But if anyone could make it work, it was the woman who'd transformed a mountain hermit into a husband and partner. "We'll need to talk to the territorial superintendent," he said practically. Get official recognition, maybe some funding assistance, and we'll need to find teachers who don't mind living at the edge of civilization. Clara's smile was brilliant, triumphant. You mean you'll help me? Clara McCrae, Jonas said solemnly. I'll help you with anything you set your mind to. Educational revolution, territorial politics, whatever comes next. We're partners in everything now. Everything. Clara agreed, then leaned over to kiss him with the kind of passion that still made Jonas's pulse race like a young man's. Outside, the first snow of autumn began to fall, just a light dusting that wouldn't last, but a reminder that winter was coming again. This time, though, Jonas felt no dread at the approaching season. Winter would bring its own challenges and pleasures, but it would also bring long evenings by the fire, time for planning and dreaming, and the kind of intimate conversations that built marriages into partnerships. Jonas, Clara said as they prepared for bed, there's one more thing I want to tell you. What's that? I think I'm fairly certain that by next spring we're going to need to expand the cabin again. Jonas paused in the act of banking the fire, her words taking a moment to penetrate. When they did, he turned to stare at her with an expression of wonder and dawning joy. Claire, you saying? I'm saying that our family is going to grow, Clara confirmed, her hand resting unconsciously on her still, flat stomach. I'm saying that by the time the lupines bloom again, there's going to be a small McCrae learning to walk in our meadow. Jonas crossed the cabin in 2 strides, gathering Clara in his arms with gentle reverence. A baby, their baby growing under Clara's heart. The idea filled him with a mixture of terror and exhilaration that reminded him of his first cavalry charge. Are you happy? Clara asked, searching his face for any sign of doubt or regret. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Jonas said hoarsely. Terrified, amazed, grateful beyond words, but happy doesn't even scratch the surface. They held each other in the firelight, 2 people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances and were now preparing to create new life together. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their mountain valley in pristine white that would melt with the spring sun to nourish Clara's garden and the wildflowers that bloomed in impossible places. Jonas McCrae, who'd spent 23 years convinced he was meant to walk through life alone, was now a husband, a teacher, a pillar of a small but growing community. More than that, he was going to be a father, a thought that filled him with equal parts joy and determination to be better than his own father had been. Clara McCrae, who'd fled into the mountains to escape a forced marriage, had found instead a partnership built on equality, respect, and love that grew stronger with each passing season. She was a wife, an educator, a healer, and soon to be a mother roles she'd chosen freely rather than having them imposed by social expectation. As they settled into bed together, Clara's head on Jonas's shoulder and his hand resting protectively over their unborn child, both understood that they'd built something rare and precious in their mountain refuge. Not just a marriage, but a true partnership. Not just a home, but a sanctuary. Not just survival, but a life worth living. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying stories of seasons past and seasons yet to come. And inside, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. In the high country, where wolves sang to the moon and most people vanished with the first frost, Jonas and Clara McCrae had built something that would endure a love strong enough to withstand winter storms and summer droughts, federal investigations, and corrupt sheriffs, the passage of time, and the inevitable changes that life would bring. They had found forever, and forever had found them ready.